Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that sounds simple on the surface, but oh boy, it gets complicated fast. How do landlocked nations get access to the sea?
Right, you are.
We're going to unpack the whole situation, especially focusing on Ethiopia, and how its quest for that access plays out with its neighbors, Eritrea and Djibouti.
Yeah, and I think for our listeners, what we're really going to kind of tease out here is how vital trade is for any country and how being landlocked makes that so much harder, but also forces some interesting partnerships.
Absolutely. We're not just talking about ships and ports here. This gets into international law, history, even the balance of power in a whole region, sovereignty, economic survival, keeping things stable, all of it's tied up together.
Right, it's kind of a perfect storm of factors, and that's why we really dug deep into this one.
We have, haven't we? I mean, UNCLOS, that's the big one, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
The law of the sea, yep.
But we also went back further, looked at older agreements that fed into that, plus reports, like from the Red Sea Task Force.
Oh yeah, they've got a lot to say about this.
And of course, we can't ignore all the current news. Things are changing fast in the Horn of Africa.
Constantly.
Yeah.
So what we aim to do today is make sense of this giant puzzle for everyone listening. Break down the rights that landlocked nations have, but also what holds them back.
The limitations, yeah.
And we're going to look at how, for better or worse, those colonial-era borders still have a huge impact in this part of the world. Plus, what are the options? What's working, what's not? What could work better?
The solutions.
Exactly. So by the end of this, you should have a really solid grasp of this complex issue.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk law. When a country's stuck inland, what does the world say about their right to reach the ocean?
Well, the foundation, the big daddy, is UNCLOS, like you said. It governs everything about how we use the oceans. And this is key. It acknowledges that landlocked states are at a natural disadvantage.
Yeah, like it's not their fault they're stuck there.
Right. And that's why Article 125 is so important. It states, straight up, landlocked states have the right to get to and from the sea. They have to go through another country, what we call a transit state.
Okay, so in this case, that would be Ethiopia needing to go through either Eritrea or Djibouti, right?
Exactly. And Article 127 goes further. It says that the transit country, they have to allow freedom of transit. All kinds of transport, no unnecessary holdups.
Can't just be like, oh, sorry, the road's closed today.
Nope. And usually they can't slap on extra customs duties or taxes or anything like that.
That makes sense. Otherwise, the transit country could hold them hostage, basically.
Exactly. And to reinforce that even more, you've got Articles 128 and 129. Non-discriminatory customs, everything streamlined, keep the goods flowing to and from the landlocked state.
Makes sense. Keep it fair, keep it moving. Now, I remember reading something about landlocked countries and fishing rights. Is that in there, too?
It is. Articles 69 and 70, they talk about that. Developing landlocked nations, if they're in the same region as a coastal state, they have special access rights. It's to any surplus of living resources in the EAZ. That's the exclusive economic zone, 200 nautical miles out.
So basically, if there are too many fish for the coastal state to handle, the landlocked state can get in on that.
In theory, yes. But, and this is a big but, it's not automatic. They have to have an agreement, regional or bilateral, whatever works. It's all about fair allocation, so they can't just go fishing wherever they want.
Got to work it out. So UNCLOS says, yes, you have the right to the sea, but then it's like, okay, now go figure out the details with your neighbors.
Exactly. It's a starting point, a foundation. And that's actually laid out specifically in Article 126. The how, the where, the cost, all of that is up to the landlocked and transit states to hash out through treaties.
Which brings us to something even older than UNCLOS, the 1965 Convention on Transit Trade of Landlocked States. How does that fit in?
That one was a landmark agreement. It was the first time that the needs of landlocked countries were really recognized on the world stage.
Like, hey, these guys need to get to the sea, too.
Exactly. And put the onus on the coastal states, said you got to let them use your ports, no discrimination, and you got to help with the infrastructure. It paved the way for what we see in UNCLOS today.
It's like UNCLOS's older, wiser, slightly less detailed sibling.
That's one way to put it. But we've got these big international laws, right? But as we've been saying, the real nitty-gritty is in those bilateral agreements. And that's where things can get tricky.
Yeah, and a great example of that is the relationship between Ethiopia and Djibouti.
Absolutely, a textbook case. You see, international law lays out the principles, but the specifics, the actual routes, the paperwork, the costs, that's all negotiated between the countries themselves.
Country-to-country diplomacy in action.
And that's where the risk comes in. Sure, it allows for tailored solutions, But if things go south politically or the economy takes a hit, the landlocked state is in a vulnerable position.
Like, oh, we're not friends anymore. Guess you can't use our port.
Yeah, it's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. And Ethiopia, sending 95% of its trade through Djibouti, that highlights the dependency.
It's a lot of eggs in one basket. So this whole right of access thing, it doesn't mean a landlocked country can just claim a chunk of their neighbor's coastline, right?
No, absolutely not. International law is very clear on this. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are paramount. Just because you have the right to reach the sea doesn't give you any right to own that land where you reach it.
So no finders keepers rules in international maritime law.
None whatsoever. Any attempt to claim ownership of another state's coastline, that's a major breach of international law. And this is where the concept of African nudi possidetis comes into play.
Now that's a mouthful. Can you break that down for us?
Basically, it says the borders you had when you gained independence, those are the borders you're stuck with. And in Africa, that usually means the borders drawn during colonialism. It's enshrined in the African Union, a cornerstone of their whole system designed to prevent constant fighting over borders.
So even if there were historical kingdoms or ethnic groups that span different territories, those colonial lines are what matters now.
Yeah, it's a way to create some stability, even if those original lines were often drawn pretty arbitrarily.
And this is especially relevant in the Horn of Africa, right? Like with Eritrea.
Big time. Eritrea's borders today are basically those of the old Italian colony.
So all of Eritrea's Red Sea coast, the ports, all of that is internationally recognized as their territory.
Completely. No question about it. And this is why those statements from Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed about the Red Sea being Ethiopia's natural border and this whole thing being existential, well, they raise a lot of eyebrows internationally.
Yeah, that sounds a bit like a challenge, doesn't it?
It does. And it's perceived as a direct threat to Eritrea's sovereignty. It's not surprising that Eritrea formed the Red Sea Task Force, made up of their own scholars and experts, specifically to push back against this kind of talk.
So they're like, no, we fought hard for our independence and these are our borders.
Exactly. And they are emphasizing that Eritrea's independence and its internationally recognized borders are not up for debate.
And if Ethiopia were to actually claim ownership of any part of Eritrea's coast, that would be a straight-up violation of international law.
No question about it. It would violate that principle of ius possidetis, which Ethiopia has upheld in the past, and it would also go against Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. That one's all about prohibiting the threat or use of force against another country's territory or independence.
Yeah, invading your neighbor to get a coastline is generally frowned upon.
You could say that. And it's really crucial to remember that distinction we talked about earlier. The right of access is not the right to ownership. Ethiopia can access the sea, but it cannot claim Eritrean territory.
Right, so any agreement has to be negotiated, respecting Eritrea's sovereignty. Now, there's also been this talk about the Afar people who are in Eritrea as justification for Ethiopia's claims. What's the reality there?
That argument just doesn't hold water, and it actually ignores history. The Afar people, they have deep roots in Eritrea. They were part of the fight for independence. To use them as an excuse to redraw borders, well, it's a slippery slope, and it violates Eritrea's sovereignty.
Yeah, it seems like picking and choosing which historical claims matter to fit a current agenda.
And it undermines the African Union and the whole idea of respecting those post-colonial borders. So it's clear, the Red Sea Task Force is there to push back hard against any attempt to undermine Eritrea's independence and its borders.
They're the guardians of Eritrean sovereignty, you could say. Now, Ethiopia is landlocked, but they do have options. They're not totally cut off. Djibouti's been key, right?
Totally. Since Eritrea became independent, Djibouti has been the main route for Ethiopia. Over 95% of their imports and exports go through there. The port of Djibouti is their lifeline, no question.
And it's not just convenience, there are formal agreements between them.
Oh, absolutely. They've got strong ties diplomatically and economically, and it's all backed up by treaties. There's the 1998 Bilateral Trade and Transit Agreement that guarantees Ethiopia good terms for using Djibouti's ports.
They've got that in writing.
They do. And then in 2018, they took it a step further with the Ethiopia-Djibouti Port Usage Agreement. Ethiopia actually bought a 19% stake in the port of Djibouti.
Wow, so they're literally invested in this.
Yeah, it's a long-term commitment, a show of how important this is to them. And let's not forget the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, the EDR. That's been a game changer.
I've heard a lot about that, how it's really sped things up.
Oh, massively. It's modern, electric, 750 kilometers long. Before, moving goods from Addis Ababa to Djibouti by truck, That took about 3 days. Now with the railway, it's 12 hours.
That's incredible.
Efficiency through the roof, plus it takes the pressure off road transport. By May 2024, they'd moved 9.5 million metric tons of cargo on that railway.
So a huge amount of goods are flowing. They've diversified what they can transport. The revenue's up. Sounds like a success story. But relying so much on one partner, one route, that has to create some anxieties, right?
It does. You always have those concerns about political instability, economic changes. What if something happens in Djibouti?
And there's the issue of costs.
Right. Ethiopia has consistently complained about the port fees, the tariffs. It adds up, affects their competitiveness.
So this all explains why Ethiopia is working so hard to find other options.
Yeah.
That deal with Somaliland, for example, that caused a stir?
It did. January 2024, they signed this deal with Somaliland, which, remember, is not internationally recognized as independent from Somalia.
Right, that's a whole other issue.
It is. But Ethiopia, they lease land in Berbera on the Red Sea to build a naval base and a commercial port.
So a military presence and an economic link.
Exactly. And there are whispers that Ethiopia might recognize Somaliland in exchange for this. Plus, Somaliland could get a stake in Ethiopian Airlines.
So it's a package deal with potentially huge implications.
Huge. This is Ethiopia trying to play the long game, get cheaper, more reliable access to the sea.
But it hasn't gone over well with Somalia.
Not at all. They see it as a violation of their sovereignty. They're lobbying internationally to stop it.
And Ethiopia and Somaliland are like, this is happening.
Full steam ahead, high stakes, lots of tension. The whole region's watching how this plays out.
Yeah, a real geopolitical powder keg. But aside from Somaliland, is Ethiopia looking at other options, even within Djibouti itself?
They are. They're already using the Tajura and Darala multipurpose ports, trying to spread the risk.
Not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Exactly. And there was talk about them jointly managing the port of Tajura with Djibouti, specifically for importing fuel.
So a specialized port just for their needs?
Yeah, but Djibouti clarified that they weren't giving up control of the port.
More of a collaboration than a takeover.
Right. And Ethiopia has also mentioned, tentatively, that they might look at using Kenya's Lamu port, but that would involve a much longer overland route.
Less ideal, logistically. So it seems like Ethiopia is actively reassessing its whole port strategy, right?
Very much so. And there have been reports that they're reviewing those old port use agreements with Djibouti, some going back 20 years.
Time for an update, maybe?
Potentially. And there are hints that the relationship between them might be cooling off a bit.
Interesting. Some high-level meetings, but no big announcements, no breakthroughs. It all comes back to that point we made earlier. Ethiopia's access to the sea. It's not just about economics. It's a core part of their whole strategy in the region.
Totally. They see it as essential for their growth, their place in the world, their influence in the Horn of Africa. And that's reflected in how Prime Minister Abiy talks about the Red Sea. Strong language, almost emotional at times.
Yeah, like it's a deeply felt issue. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Saudi Arabia. They seem to be taking a big interest in Eritrea's ports, specifically Assab. What's their game here?
Saudi Arabia, they're playing a long game with both economic and geopolitical goals. They want to boost trade routes in the Red Sea. That's a vital corridor. And their Vision 2030 plan, all about diversifying their economy, that hinges on controlling key shipping routes.
So, less reliance on oil, more on trade and logistics.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it goes beyond just money. This is about power in the Red Sea. They want to be a major player, maybe even challenge the existing influence of the UAE, Turkey, China.
So they're stepping into a crowded, competitive space.
They are. They're doing it with their eyes wide open.
Mm.
And the way they see it, developing the port of Assab, that's a strategic win.
And a big investment, billions of dollars, potentially.
Big money, big potential. It could integrate Eritrea and maybe even Ethiopia down the line into the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. That opens up new markets, new partnerships. And geopolitically, it strengthens Eritrea, maybe give them a bit of leverage against any potential moves by Ethiopia.
Like a counterweight.
You got it. Plus, Saudi Arabia, they've always been concerned about food security, and the Red Sea region plays into that. So lots of factors at play, all converging on Assab.
A lot of moving pieces. So the Saudi involvement, it's a potential shakeup of the power dynamics in the Horn.
Absolutely. If Assab becomes a major hub, that could shift trade flows, overshadow other ports, create new alliances. It's a bold move.
High risk, high reward. So Eritrea, they've got these valuable assets on their coastline. Tell us a bit more about Massawa and Assab, the ports themselves, and what's the investment climate like there?
They do. They've got prime real estate on the Red Sea, Massawa up north, Natural deepwater harbor, historically a major trading center.
Like a natural gateway.
It is. And they've designated it a free trade zone, but as of last year, 2024, that hadn't fully kicked in yet.
Still a work in progress. And Assab, the one getting all the Saudi attention.
Yeah, down south. It's their second largest port, also deep water, can handle the big ships. All the equipment you need, lots of storage, including oil terminals, and its location right near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, that's crucial.
That's a major choke point for global shipping, right?
Exactly. Any disruption there sends ripples through the world economy.
So Assab's got the natural advantages, the infrastructure, the location. What about the laws governing all this maritime activity?
Well, we know they've got the Eritrean port regulations from 2005 and a transitional maritime law from way back in 1991. They've also worked with the UN on maritime law training.
So they're not starting from scratch.
No, but the specifics, the full legal framework, that's a bit unclear. We need more information.
More research needed. Now, for any investor, that overall climate, how easy is it to do business? That matters a lot, right?
Huge factor. And according to the U.S. State Department, as of this year, Eritrea, well, it's not the easiest place to invest.
Lots of red tape.
That and U.S. sanctions, no comprehensive commercial code, they're cut off from a lot of international finance. Plus, tight government controls on trade.
So even with Saudi Arabia interested, there are hurdles.
Oh, definitely. It'll be interesting to see how they navigate that if those hurdles get lowered. And then there's the China and Russia angle.
Right, Eritrea seems to be getting closer to them.
They are, and that has implications. China's already building stuff there, part of their Belt and Road initiative.
Expanding their influence.
Yep. And there's talk of both China and Russia wanting military bases in the Horn of Africa, and Eritrea seems open to it.
So lots of external players, lots of potential influence. Okay, stepping back again, let's talk big picture. What are the challenges that landlocked nations in general face when trying to get to the sea?
The biggest one is obvious. You're reliant on your neighbors.
At their mercy, in a way.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
You need those agreements, those treaties, and those can be complicated, can be fragile. Politically, economically, things change.
Today's friend is tomorrow's rival.
Sadly, that happens. And then there's the cost. Transport over land, that's expensive, time-consuming, more logistics, more paperwork.
Inefficiency eats away at your competitiveness.
It does. And then there's the constant worry. What if something goes wrong in the transit country? Political upheaval, infrastructure breakdown, you're vulnerable. And Ethiopia's reliance on Djibouti, that really brings all these challenges to the forefront.
Yeah, that high dependence on one route, the complaints about costs, it all makes sense now. But in that specific case, the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, that's been a positive development.
Oh, for sure, a big win. That railway, it's cut transport time drastically, increased cargo volume, made the whole system more efficient. Plus, the revenue it generates, that strengthens their ties.
So proof that good infrastructure can really help overcome those inherent landlocked disadvantages. Now, let's go back to those colonial borders. You've talked about how important they are, the whole Uta Poseidus thing. Why are those borders such a sensitive issue in the Horn of Africa and in Africa in general?
Because those lines drawn by European powers, they're the foundation of the current map. Eritrea's independence, Ethiopia becoming landlocked, that's all a direct result of those colonial borders.
A legacy of colonialism that still shapes everything.
It does. And African nations, after independence, they said, okay, we're sticking with these borders no matter how messed up they might be. Uti Poseidus, that's the principle, and it's there to prevent constant warfare over territory.
Choose stability over potential chaos.
Exactly. And when Ethiopia talks about the Red Sea as their natural border, well, that's directly challenging those colonial borders, challenging the whole idea of Uti Poseidus. And the commission that settled the Ethiopia-Eritrea border war, they reaffirmed very clearly that those colonial lines are the law.
No going back, no redrawing the map. But the problem is those lines often ignored existing ethnic or cultural boundaries, right?
Big time. The colonial powers, they didn't care about splitting up communities, lumping different groups together. And that's what makes the AFAR situation so complicated. Their traditional lands are split between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti.
So these borders, they're both a source of stability and a source of potential conflict.
Exactly. And when Ethiopia uses the AFAR people in Eritrea as an argument for their claims, well, a lot of people see that as cherry-picking history to fit their current goals.
Conveniently reinterpreting the past.
It undermines Djibouti's sovereignty, too. So the message from many is clear. respect those post-colonial borders, no matter how imperfect they might be.
No exceptions. Okay, so given all of this, the legal complexities, the regional politics, what are some practical things Ethiopia can do to get reliable and affordable access to the sea?
The first thing to remember is being landlocked isn't an automatic economic death sentence. How well a country does, it depends on a lot of things. Good governance, lack of conflict, stability. And look, Ethiopia has its problems, but it's not the poorest country in the region.
So internal factors matter just as much, if not more.
Absolutely. So Ethiopia should focus on fixing those internal issues and on working with their neighbors, not against them. Diplomacy, cooperation, that's the key.
You mentioned the East African community, the EAC, as a good model. What do they do that works?
The EAC shows how regional integration can work. Landlocked members can access the sea through their coastal neighbors. Everyone benefits. It's a win-win. And historically, neither Eritrea nor Djibouti has completely blocked Ethiopia's access. They know it's in their economic interest to keep that trade flowing. Plus, for Ethiopia, the distances to the sea are relatively short compared to some landlocked countries.
Some countries have it much worse.
They do. So building up those economic ties, creating a stronger sense of regional cooperation, that's a much better path than unilateral action or threats.
Strength in number, strength in collaboration. Now, there's this idea that landlocked countries need their own navies to protect their trade. What's your take on that?
Well, Ethiopia hasn't had a navy, and their trade hasn't exactly been under constant attack. They rely on commercial shipping, and the International Maritime Security Framework generally works.
So a navy might be more of a want than a need.
Possibly. Now, if they really want that naval presence, one idea is to lease a coastal strip from a neighbor, a mutually beneficial deal. But honestly, their biggest security threats are internal, not out at sea.
So focusing inward makes more sense at this point. We talked earlier about the ICJ ruling in the Bolivia-Chile case. Just a reminder for our listeners, what were the big lessons from that?
That case showed how international law can only do so much. Bolivia lost its coastline, went to the ICJ to try and force Chile to negotiate giving them access, but the court said no. Historical treaties, even if they're old, they still carry weight. They define those borders.
So no matter how much you might want to change the map, those old agreements matter. Now, as if all of this wasn't complicated enough, we've got this looming issue of climate change. How will that affect landlocked countries like Ethiopia?
Climate change. That's a whole new level of challenge. Rising sea levels, extreme weather, all of that threatens the infrastructure that landlocked countries rely on. Ports, roads, railways, all vulnerable. And that means higher costs, less competitiveness, potential disruptions to trade, even food security issues.
So climate change makes an already difficult situation even harder.
It does. And it means that any new infrastructure, it has to be built with climate resilience in mind.
Thinking long-term, anticipating those risks.
Exactly. And trade itself, that will become even more important, a way for landlocked countries to manage those shocks to the system. So, to wrap things up, what are the big trends, the things to watch for, that will shape how landlocked nations get to the sea in the future?
Looking ahead, what's on the horizon?
Technology is a big one. We're seeing digital trade corridors, more efficient railways, like the one Ethiopia and Djibouti built.
So technology to streamline the process, cut costs.
Exactly. And then regional integration. That's going to be huge. The EAC is a good example, but we'll see more of that. Countries working together, sharing infrastructure, harmonizing their regulations.
A more collaborative approach.
It makes sense, but of course, geopolitics will always be a factor. Those transit routes, those ports, they're strategically important, and that influences international relations.
The big powers will always be watching.
They will. And at the end of the day, being landlocked is a disadvantage economically, no way around it. So cooperation, aligning those economic interests, that's how you create win-win situations.
It's the most sustainable path. All right, listeners, that was a lot to take in, but let's recap. International law, it says you have the right to reach the sea, but not to claim someone else's land. And those colonial borders, they might be arbitrary, but they're the foundation of the current map, no matter how much some might want to change that. Ethiopia, they face challenges, but their access through Djibouti is working, especially with that new railway. But trying to force things, making unilateral moves, that's not going to end well.
They won't.
The solution is respect, agreements, and working together regionally for everyone's benefit.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And as we sign off here, it's worth thinking about this. History, international law, economic ambitions, all of that is colliding in this issue of maritime access. And then we add climate change on top of it all. So what are the solutions we haven't even thought of yet? What can countries achieve if they truly work together, think outside the box? How can we overcome those limitations of geography?
That's the real challenge and the potential reward for landlocked nations in the 21st century.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.